So thank you all very much for coming along. My name is Eamon Carey, and yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about inspiration, but to give you some context as to why I'm standing here. I am a three-time founder, two of which thankfully were successful, one of which was a gigantic car crash, but we can talk about that or a learning experience, as I prefer to think of it now. We can talk about that in the Q&A. And now have been an angel investor and VC investor for the last couple of years. So ran Techstars in London and in New York, invested in a bunch of companies there, ran an angel syndicate with some friends, invested in more, and now I'm a partner at a VC fund in Estonia, investing in Estonia and the new Nordics and beyond. So I've invested in about 100 companies across US, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and kind of watched a whole bunch of interesting things happen. So I'm going to talk to you today about the talk title. So I think Brian thought it was a little bit like Beckett when I sent it to him first, but actually it's from someone who was influential more recently. It's a quote from Kurt Cobain's journal saying, "Do your own thing, others own their own thing. If you copy too much, you'll find yourself in late night cocktail lounge cover band Limbo." Right? And so what I want to talk to you about today is like ideas and inspiration and where it comes from, and looking in places that are maybe a little bit more non-obvious than what's in our backyard or to the west of us. So I'm going to take you back in time to 2005, when a bunch of really interesting things happened for me. So 17 years ago, I studied journalism in college because computer science was too hard. They had too many hours. And so journalism had like 10 hours a week, so I could work selling guitars and do a bunch of stuff that I thought was more interesting. But I'd learned how to code when I was a kid, so I was the annoying person who built websites for his dad's friends and tried to kind of make money doing various different things like that. And so I was, the first person with broadband on our street, like obsessed with IRC and Usenet and all of these kind of different things. And so in my day job, I was a producer and presenter on RTE Radio, which is like the Irish equivalent of the BBC. And I spent my entire time saying to my bosses, like, we should be taking this internet thing more seriously, right? We should be podcasting. We should be putting up blogs. We should be listing our playlists. We should be doing all of this. And the dominant feedback that I got back then was, the internet was kind of a fad, right? Like everyone thought it was going to be a big deal in 99, 2000, and then it blew it, right? But newspapers, like, they're solid. They've been around for 80 years. Like, there's no reason to think that they won't be around for another 80. So I was kind of banging my head against the wall, and it was pretty frustrating, frankly. But RT was a job for life. Like, I couldn't be fired. So, it was kind of tempting to stay there. But the catalyst, the thing that really changed my life was taking a trip. Does anyone know what city this is? So it's Seoul in South Korea. It's from an awkward angle. There's a few more landmarks if you kind of flip this around. So a couple of friends of mine from college had gone out to Seoul to be English teachers when we finished. And they said, hey, come over. I had some time off, so I went over for 2 weeks and hung out. And Seoul is an amazing place, right? Like, Korean food is incredible, music is incredible, architecture, the people, everything was amazing. It was also in 2005 like the most foreign place I'd ever gone, right? And I mean that in the context of nothing was in English and no one spoke English. So to go, and obviously at the time I had like a really shitty phone, so I had a book with a map in it, and that's how you found your way around. And you're kind of like, okay, I think I get off at the station where it's like the last character looks like a man wearing a hat, right? So you kind of try and navigate your way around like a proto-understanding of the Korean language. But it was incredible, right? Like I spent a bunch of time over there, and the moment that really kind of changed things was on the subway. So you have an amazing subway system, and I was sitting on it one day probably going to a bar, right, to be perfectly honest. But I sat in a lot of subway cars before. And this guy came and he sat next to me. And he took something out of his pocket that in my head is permanently imprinted as like this kind of onyx slab, basically. And he picked it up, he looked at it, and he started watching Spider-Man. Right, Spider-Man 2, actually, the Tobey Maguire one, which dates it. And I was kind of sitting there going, is anyone else seeing this? So he's watching Spider-Man, and then, so of course, creepily, I'm like, I need to kind of see where this goes. Thankfully, he got off at the same station as me. And as he got off, he switched off Spider-Man, and he did something that, to me, looked like he was sending a text message on the same device, right? So he had something that was kind of like this, right? This is not the device that he had, but this is one of the Korean devices that were out at the time, right? They had this DMB mobile TV trial that was running, where you had a phone, and on the side it could receive terrestrial TV broadcast, but you could also store videos on it and play it, right? And I was slack-jawed, right? I was like, fucking hell. Like some bloke has come back from the future just to kind of tease me, like sit next to me, and no one else has noticed, like some Truman Show shit or something like this. Anyway, so it was incredible. And now you kind of think, well, of course I can like send a message and watch Spider-Man on the train or whatever. Also, he was doing this underground, right? I still can't do that. If I wanted to watch Spider-Man 2 on a train in London, I can't. The internet doesn't go down there. Right, it goes fucking everywhere else, right? So it was incredible. What was more incredible was like this was kind of the state of the art that I had in my pocket, right? It had like 72 colors, like, you know, predictive text. Like, oh my God, we're really kind of like at the edge of technological capability. And so, and this phone actually didn't even work. They had a different wireless standard over there, so it was totally useless. But I kind of saw this guy, and then for the rest of the trip, spent my time kind of creepily looking at people in the subway and just kind of noticing things that were happening. I went to a mall in Gangnam one day, and there were a bunch of people crowded around a TV screen watching something. And in Dublin or in London, normally, that would be a football match, right? There, it was a bunch of people watching people play StarCraft, right? And I kind of came back from that trip going, the world is about to change in a very fundamental way, right? Like, and it's not the internet that I need to think about anymore. Like the internet, fuck that, it had its moment in 99, 2000. Like now it's mobile, right? Now we should be putting everything on our phones. The challenge was I was going back and telling a market where everyone owned this phone rather than this one, like, oh, let's produce content for a phone. They were like, I can't even take a picture. Like, I'm not going to watch a TV show on it. They didn't even have WAP probably back then, right? So it was kind of a tough sell. And in the end, I kind of went, you know what? I'm so obsessed with this idea of mobile being the future, and I'm so convinced that it is the case that I quit my job. I quit my job for life. I went to my parents and I said, I'm going to be a startup founder, right? And in Dublin in the early 2000s, you were either going to be like a builder, an engineer, a doctor, or a lawyer, or a failure, right? Like the kid that no one talked about. I was like, oh, I'm going to build stuff for mobile. Thankfully, my parents were kind of like, oh, Jesus, here's another harebrained scheme. Like, you know, let's hope it goes okay. But myself and a friend of mine started a company based mostly actually out of frustration that no one was taking this stuff seriously. But what we found was when we went and spoke to big companies who knew a lot more than people in the media industry, actually they took it really seriously. So we ended up signing contracts with 3 and O2 and Guinness and Captain Morgan's and Emirates and a bunch of other people. And in the space of, you know, kind of 3 years, we went from being 2 blokes in a picnic table in my co-founder's back garden to like having offices here. We'd opened an office in Dubai. We built that business out and, you know, did quite well just doing stuff on mobile, right? Making content, doing podcasts, making videos. And obviously we were in a really good position in 2007 and 2008 when all of our stuff that we've been saying about everything, the future being mobile, crystallized when the iPhone and Android kind of came out and came to prominence. And so we built our own apps and built apps for lots of other people, et cetera, et cetera. But that trip was the catalyst. Like if that guy hadn't sat next to me on the subway, I'd probably still be presenting like, you know, the sports news on RTE or something like this. I mean, probably unlikely, but let's just pretend in the multiverse that I'm still doing that somewhere. And subsequently, we sold that business, but I've ended up going over and back to Korea and Japan and Hong Kong and Taiwan and lots of places in that part of the world over the last couple of years, and have seen kind of the technology that starts there evolving and coming over to this neck of the woods increasingly frequently. I love karaoke. This is when we launched the product in Taiwan. They brought us to probably the most luxurious karaoke room I've ever been to. But it's a fascinating part of the world for a whole bunch of different reasons. The challenge is that actually the kind of dominant narrative about apps coming out of China or Japan or Korea or Vietnam or Indonesia or anywhere else is that everyone always used to talk about them as clones, right? Like they're copycats, a copycat app, like they're copying Airbnb, they're copying blah, 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 blah. And so you see all of these think pieces going, oh, WeChat is, you know, China's Facebook, Baidu is Google, you know, Weibo is Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. What they never kind of took into account was like, yes, there were some similarities between these products and the Western counterpart. There were also lots of differences, right? Like they'd evolved in very different ways. That's not to say that there weren't copycats, right? If anyone remembers the game Flappy Bird, you know, the second company I started was in the games industry, and so I saw firsthand how kind of copycatting really works. But like Flappy Bird was copycatted a bunch of different times, right? So when IP becomes successful, it's kind of inevitable that people will be inspired by it. Like that's how things work. But there was a lot of kind of hand-wringing right? And kind of think pieces like, the episode of The Simpsons, like, won't someone please think of the children? What are we going to do about all of these copycat apps? And the question I was always thinking is like, is it a copycat or is it a remix, right? Like, where does this idea come from? And one of the things that I've seen time and time again as a VC and as a founder is that, well, let me ask a question first of all. How many people in this room have a business idea that is so amazing that if they told anyone else in this room, that person would immediately run off and do it themselves, right? So I have been that person, and I know there are hands down there, and you're feeling guilt inside. I'm an Irish Catholic, I can tell, right? I can sense it like a spidey sense. Everyone has to go to confession. But I think there is this really interesting thing that happens where a bunch of cool stuff happens, ideas kind of accumulate around that, and similar businesses are born. The third company that I started, which was a failure, was an ed tech company, which was ironic because I wasn't particularly good in school. I didn't know anything about the US SATs, and maybe you're learning why it failed. I didn't do any customer development or do anything else. But we launched this like super secret idea, like, ooh, we better not tell anyone that we're thinking about like putting education on a mobile phone, like, galaxy brain shit there. But we launched it, and there were like 4 companies that we'd never heard of doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. And there is this kind of biological idea of convergent evolution that you see in ideas as well, right? So there's the concept of multiple discovery or simultaneous invention. Right? So you see it in science where very frequently when they announce a Nobel Prize, it's not just one person who wins it anymore, it's 2 or 3 people who've kind of come up with the same theory at roughly the same time, usually independent of one another, right? So calculus, Leibniz and Newton discovered it roughly the same time, right? Darwin wasn't the only person who theorized evolution, right? So there's a bunch of kind of ideas that come out at the same time. So, in biology, they say it's why insects and birds have wings, right? And they both evolved at the same time, even though they're obviously very different branches of the tree. So my thesis is actually like a lot of these ideas, whether it be Weibo or Youku or anything else, kind of would have evolved independent of YouTube starting or anything else. It's an easy finger to point to say people are copycats. That's not to say that copycats don't exist. If anyone here works for Xerox PARC or knows anyone who does, ask them how they feel about Microsoft and Apple and graphical user interfaces. And I don't think they will be big fans. But anyway, this stuff happens. And I think one of the really interesting things is kind of thinking about the cultural zeitgeist and how that's been changing over the years. And if you look at 1980s movies, which I spent a lot of time doing in the 1980s, the way that they depicted kind of Japanese culture back then was very like automaton and kind of robot-like. But culture started to evolve, right? Like Sony gave us what I think were still the best Walkmen, or Walkmans, however you want to call the plural. They really started to kind of influence culture. They started to kind of shift the perception of Japanese products, Japanese manufacturing. It became very, very cool, right? In the gaming world, again, this is how I spent a lot of time in the 1990s. Sega, Nintendo, Mario, Zelda, like all of these products, all of these brands kind of starting to come into the home, become kind of very much part of the kind of cultural zeitgeist. In fact, it's really in the last 10 years that like Xbox and Oculus and a couple of others have kind of caught up with Japanese console makers and game makers. The movie industry, like Akira, Spirited Away, like, you can see the kind of influence that Japan was starting to have on the world, and how much now, if you talk to directors or if you read interviews with directors, like the extent to which they were massively influenced by these movies. And it's a generational thing, right? Like where I had, the Sony Walkman and Akira, my brother had a Super Nintendo and Pikachu, right? Like this is kind of continually going on. And what's interesting is, in most cases, this was actually government policy. So in Korea in 97, after the financial crash, they created this concept they call Hallyu, which is like it's a Chinese word for the Korean wave. But it was a government initiative to go, we want to be the #1 exporter of culture in the world within the next 30 years. Right? And so they poured money into all sorts of initiatives. So in South Korea was the first country to have like a national broadband plan. So everyone got connected to broadband. Now everyone is getting connected to like ultra high speed fiber over there. They funded movie studios. They funded theatrical academies where bands like BTS and others kind of came together. And you started to see the results in a fairly kind of substantial way, right? So almost 10 years. It's fucking 10 years since this happened, by the way, right? Like, how old am I? So Gangnam Style was the first. I'm not going to do the dance. Was the first video to hit 1 billion views on YouTube. Became like this total cultural phenomenon. More recently, I'm sure a lot of people watch this, right? Like, again, Squid Game has spawned. They're making a reality, like an actual version of Squid Game, presumably with fewer machine guns, for Netflix. Although who knows in the kind of hellscape that society is today. So I think the really interesting thing is, back in the day, people never talked about Samsung products. They talked about Samsung products because they were so faulty and shitty. The view that the Korean government had was that if they can start to influence culture, then people will start to see more Korean products like LG and Samsung products and various different things in movies and in TV shows and everything else. And as like Korean soap operas are some of the biggest in the world, and even in Turkey, Middle East, Africa, various different places. Their view is actually the entire economy would be boosted. So it's not just the kind of cultural side of the economy, but Samsung would do better, LG, all of these companies. They made this kind of dream Korean, which is interesting. But most of you here are founders or product people, right? So it's not just culture where we see that influence. It's increasingly now in the products that we're building and in the products that I'm seeing when people are coming to me saying, hey, I've got an idea or an MVP. I want to talk about some of the differences between kind of this neck of the woods and that neck of the woods. And some of the biggest ones are in the kind of design, right? In Europe and the US, people tend to favor very sleek, kind of elegant, minimal design, right? You think of the Google homepage, right? The pale blue, calming Facebook homepage, etc. And then you look at Baidu, right? Like, you're doing the same thing. It's search engine. There's just way more information on there. If you look at the difference between TripAdvisor on the left and Ctrip on the right, they're the same products, right? It's a travel app. It allows you to make bookings and do things. In this part of the world, we've kind of adhered to a view like a U2 guitar line, right? Less is more. In Asia, increasingly what we see is actually more is better. And it's interesting to kind of, having launched products over there, which I'll talk about in a minute, some of the feedback that we got from folks in Taiwan and Hong Kong and Japan and Korea is that here we tend to search, right? We will go looking for something. There, they prefer that kind of lean back browsing experience, which is why you have this real density of information on the page. I'll touch on the kind of concept of super apps in a couple of minutes' time, but there again, you have these products that have everything in it, right? It's like a combination of Skyscanner and Uber Eats and WhatsApp and Revolut and everything else all in one place. We tend to have those as kind of discrete apps, although we'll talk about why people want that to change. And it's also this difference in what they think of as kind of high context and low context culture and language. So Japanese, Chinese, Korean, they're very formal languages, in many cases actually extremely complicated languages. And so there's a lot of context that needs to be added in, which is why you have way more text on the pages in many cases. The stupidest theory I've heard, which I just put these slides up to advance, is I saw a guy give a talk about this before, and he was like, the reason this is the case is because streets in Europe are wider and less densely packed, and streets in Asia look like this. I was like, mate, you're fucking reaching. Like, that is crazy. But this is a product called Linguist, which is a language learning app. So powered by AI. So hopefully some of you use it, but similar to kind of Duolingo and Babbel and others. We raised some money from a Japanese investor a couple of years ago and launched the product in Taiwan and Japan. And as I was saying, we and the head of design, John, spent so much time like getting the design perfect. Like, it was beautiful. Sleek, we were kind of like, this is Apple Design Awards category. Like, we could win this. We brought it over to Japan when we were doing some of the user testing, and we got this. So it went out. A bunch of people tested the app, and they gave us some feedback. And we had one of the product managers from Rakuten sit us down and give us the feedback, and he was so embarrassed. He was like, oh, he had to deliver some real. He was like, these people think that your app is a product for idiots. Like, it's like something that was designed for children. There's no context. There's no additional info. Like, why is there nothing on the screen? Like, this product is not fully built yet, was kind of the impression that they got. And it was a really salutary lesson, like, and one that I've taken, like, that was a couple of years ago. We've subsequently launched a bunch of products in that part of the world. But it is interesting when you're localizing products to think not just about like, oh, I need to translate everything, it's like you also need to think about what's the dominant kind of user experience. How do people like to use products over there? How much are you going to have to adapt? The answer is like a lot to actually kind of build something that people are kind of useful or used to. And you can see their influence starting to creep in, right? So Baidu Maps, WeChat has a mapping function where you can see your friends, like a bunch of the kind of big Chinese products and Japanese like Line, Kakao, and others. They've had these kind of heat maps for quite a long time, showing you where your friends are, where the activity is in cities, etc. Does anyone here use Snap? Okay, one person. Okay, play that short position. So they've been doing it now. If you've got the most, I confess I do use Snap every so often. If you look at the new version of Instagram, they're starting to introduce more mapping and more kind of location functionality in their products. So you can start to see this kind of user experience and user interface starting to creep into this part of the world, right? I mean, everyone should be aware of this at this stage. Like I remember using TikTok a couple of years ago when it kind of came out first and going, my God, it's so busy. Like my eyes are going to bleed if I look at this for too long. Now it's like the biggest thing on earth. It's probably the biggest cultural influence. Like if you talk to people in the music industry, they're literally obsessed, not with getting their music into the charts, but making sure that influencers use their music in TikTok videos, because that's the fastest way to go viral. That's the fastest way to get lots and lots of views. It's less about Psy and 1 billion views on YouTube and much more about how do you influence this. And you can see the kind of influence of TikTok starting to kind of bleed into other products. This is a company called Hago that we invested in a while ago, which is a virtual tour company, right? So you can you have a guide live streaming this walk in the mountains or a walk along the canals in Venice, et cetera, et cetera. And again, previous versions of this, if this product had been built 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been a sleeker design. There would have been less on the screen. I remember when I looked at this first, I was like, it actually feels busy. So on top left, you can expand the map. You can see where you're walking. There's kind of photography buttons, gallery buttons that you can go into, a lot of kind of menu options on the top. And none of this is hidden by default. This is all on screen all the time. So again, for me, the founders of this business are Canadian, but they spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, and you can really see kind of how that influenced the user experience and the user interface of that product. And it's also kind of starting to influence how people use products. And I think, again, we'll see an awful lot more of this over the next little while. So how many people agree with this?
Depends how long it is.
Most of them are fucking long, right? It's for the ones I send. So if anyone here has ever gotten one from me, I'm sorry. But like, we have been waiting for a really long time for the promise of Alexa or Siri or Google Assistant or anything else to start to pay off. But again, if you go, when I was in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, I would say probably 30 or 40% of the people that I saw when they were using WeChat in particular, they weren't typing, they were talking, right? They were sending voice messages, particularly older people. And there's, there are questions around literacy and the complexity of the Chinese language, etc. But it's also kind of ease of use. The thing that I noticed, and this, now Baidu say about 20% of their searches, total searches, which is a lot, is now coming on voice, right? So voice interfaces are hugely popular, and you can start to see it bleeding in over here. The moment that it occurred to me that it was becoming something that I do all the time is when we had a kid, right? You have a kid, the kid takes most of your arms, but you have to time a lot of things, a lot of timers, right? Like this food needs to be on for this long, these soothers need to be sterilized, this other thing. And so I started using voice, and I increasingly now use it in other products. And again, the companies that I'm seeing coming in and pitching me today that will hopefully be the big companies that we're all talking about in 5 or 10 years' time, loads and loads of them are thinking about voice as an interface. So I think we'll definitely see an awful lot more in that. In shopping, right, like live shopping on mobile is like the biggest thing since sliced bread. It's about 10%, it's more now, it's I think about 15% of all e-commerce in China. And it's kind of billions and billions of dollars being spent on it, and it's very simple. It's just a real person. It's like QVC, right? If anyone's old enough to remember that, it's like QVC, but just someone sitting. And maybe some of you saw there was a really popular image went around Twitter a couple of days ago of like tons of people just sitting in a warehouse with ring lights on them doing this live shopping. Again, societal hellscape, but it is indicative of a wider trend that we're starting to see. McKinsey said it was 10% of the e-commerce market in 2020. It was worth 171 billion. This is just in China in 2021, and 420 billion is what the projection is for this year. So it's like going up at a rapid pace. And I promise it's 420 billion. This isn't some Elon Musk weed joke, although I fuck it, I like it. But we've invested in the last 6 months in 3 companies that are doing live shopping in the US, in Sweden and here in London, right? Super great. Ended up raising money from Benchmark afterwards. They're doing kind of live streaming of beauty products. We've got a company called Stackend that's powering live shopping for anyone with a Shopify marketplace, and then Skin Days that are in the kind of beauty space as well, right? And so already super great. Their average in-app time per day is 20 minutes, right? Which is really high. Like if you were an e-commerce site and you had people, if you were any shop and someone spent 20 minutes in there every day, that's pretty significant. And you know, there's a whole bunch of reasons that we can go into in the Q&A why that's the case. We'll touch quickly on super apps, because I've got 4 minutes left. So I mentioned it earlier, right? Like WeChat is a very busy product. We don't see, so the version of WeChat, if you download it and use it here, you'll think it's kind of a messaging app. What is he talking about? The version of WeChat that you use if you're in China is very, very different, because it's not just a messaging app, it is that, but it's also like a supermarket and a travel agent and the place that you can pay your taxes and the place that you can register your kid's birth, and you know, you can do basically, you can run your entire life from one product. And it's huge, right? Like basically everyone in China uses it. It's probably maybe still one of the most dominant kind of payment methods in that part of the world as well. And there are a bunch of super apps over there. And it's interesting to see now these growth stage companies and public companies kind of coming out and going, we're positioning ourselves as a super app, right? So Revolut has decided that it's going to be a fintech super app. Somewhat unclear exactly what that means, but it's the ambition that they have. This one I love. So PayPal decided that they don't want to just be an online checkout button. They want to be a super app as well. The irony is in the quote. The idea came to the PayPal CEO during a dinner 3 years ago with the president of WeChat. As the two dined, a picture began forming in his head. I wonder how that fucking happened. Copycat. That's not inspiration. But Facebook, you know, are obsessed with this. Snap are obsessed with this as well. Like there are so many companies trying to, you know, and Facebook have been trying to do it for a long time. And I think now, like the kind of existential threat that TikTok poses to them means that they'll focus on that a lot more than the super app thing. But I think this is definitely something that Snap are working on pretty heavily. Some of the industries that are interesting that I'm now looking at kind of what's happening in that part of the world coming over here, just to kind of wind us down. What is the average salary for a teacher in this country? Take a guess. It's about 30 grand, like 25, 30 when you're starting out, and 30 to 40 as you get bigger. This is a guy called Kim Ko-hoon. He is an English teacher in Korea. How much money do you think he made last year? 80 grand? He made $4 million. Right? Now, how many people here would quit their job and become a teacher if I said, I'll pay you $4 million a year? Like, fucking A, I'm in. Like, I'm not correcting homework, but I'll do the talk. So online education is absolutely enormous in all of these markets, right? Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, China, Korea, et cetera, et cetera. 1.5 million people have taken his courses online, which is a fairly staggering number. He now has his own publishing company, so not only did he make 4 million quid, his publishing company made another 10 million on top of it, so that's nice. There's a company called Megastudy in Korea where actually the majority of the teachers are making 6 figures, and the best ones are making into the millions of dollars, doing this kind of online tutoring, online test prep, et cetera, et cetera. And there's money starting to go into this sector here as well. So the guys from Preply who went through Techstars in Berlin when I was mentoring there just raised a bunch of money recently to kind of build out their tutoring marketplace, and the growth that they're seeing is astronomical. And I think part of that is COVID fueled, right? Like everyone went, oh, actually, you know, online education became a thing again, and a useful and viable thing. So we're starting to see an awful lot more happening in that space. I will finish by talking a little bit about robots. I got 56 seconds. Intelligent toilets, right? Just because quantified self wasn't enough to track your sleep and your heart rate and everything else. If anyone went to April Dunford's talk yesterday, she talked about buying a Toto toilet. Well, if she'd waited, she could have bought their intelligent health toilet that will monitor all of your output and give you stats and ratings, right? Exciting times for humanity. Can't wait to share that one with my doctor and my friends. This has been going on for years. Actually, I saw a company presenting exactly this kind of thesis back in 2007. And the other one that's really interesting is robots. Like, so if you check into a hotel in Japan, a lot of the time there will be a Pepper robot there that will kind of greet you. It will show you useful information about the hotel, etc. But in old folks' homes, right? Obviously, Japan, Korea, a lot of these markets have rapidly aging populations, which is not a problem that's unique to them. Increasingly in care homes, these are now being used to interact with people on a day-to-day basis. And I think actually this problem of aging populations is one of the biggest ones that's still relatively unsolved from a tech and startup perspective. So I think there's going to be massive, massive opportunities in that part of the world over the next couple of years. What I would close by saying is when you are thinking about ideas or inspiration or anything else, do not be tempted to just go west, but instead, in the words of Gandalf the White, or Grey as he was at the time, look to the east. Thank you very much.